Greetings, welcome back to Micro-Digressions. This is Spencer Case, your host. So happy New Year, everybody. It's hard to believe we're about halfway through the 2020s, and it feels like it can't go anywhere but up from here. So, a few announcements. One, subscribe to YouTube if you haven't already. It'll give you an update every time there's a new episode, and I know most of you are just listening to the audio, but sometimes it's fun to watch us talk for a bit. If you want to do that, you might check it out. Second thing is fan mail. That's a thing that Buzzsprout started doing last year. And there's a little notification that says, tell Spencer your thoughts about this episode. One person from, Bothell, Washington, has sent me one. Thank you to whoever that is. And you can reach me that way. You can just send, hey, like the episode, whatever, or hate it, and I'll get it. So just want you to know that does, in fact, work. I also might have to take a bit of a break. My second child is arriving soon. May and I are very excited about that, and also a little nervous. I have not missed more than 2 monthly cycles on this podcast for 5 years. It'll be 5 years in March. But I might have to miss an episode or two when that happens. It's going to be a very hectic time, so I might have to take a break. But I'll be back. If you don't hear from me for a while, know that I will be back. Let's see what else. I've been inviting some famous people on, just sort of branch out a bit. Nobody said yes yet. But, I've gotten some polite rejections. That's encouraging. So, maybe there'll be some surprises there. All right, I think that's all for announcements. This episode is going to be on this book here, Why It's Okay to Be a Gamer, by Sarah Malinowski and Nicholas Bima in the Routledge Why It's Okay series. And it's a really fun conversation. I feel like last year was a little bit heavy on the politics. I think I need to branch out a bit and make sure that I'm not having too many political episodes, because thank God there is more to life than politics. So this is a fun episode, and it gets into a lot of interesting themes, and I hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Micro-Digressions, Sarah and Nick. So I enjoyed reading Why It's Okay to Be a Gamer. And so I wanted to actually ask you something that didn't come up in that book, but it was on my mind when I read it. I remember a commercial from about 15 years ago. I don't remember what it was a commercial for, but it was making a joke at the expense of gamers. And it was something like, this one was saying, I'm so proud of my son. He works so hard playing video games. He's devoting so much time into it and putting so much effort. She just goes on and on praising him like this. And the joke was like, ha, 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 your son's a loser, But then I thought, wait a minute, that's like the prejudice. But is there really anything backing that up? Like, if we think that there's such a thing as perfectionistic value in sports achievements or artistic achievements, then why wouldn't there be similar value to be had in accomplishing, a high degree of skill in some video game? What do you think?
Yeah, so I definitely agree, but just to play, I guess, start with devil's advocate, why would you think, just why intuitively would someone be like, well, athletes are really impressive, but gamers are not? And I think probably it's tied to physical attributes. You just look at someone and maybe you don't have to be as in peak physical shape to be a great gamer. And then also the movements are subtle. And I think when you just look at it, you're like, well, I could do that, surely. And then until you try or play someone really great, it just exposes that it does require a great deal of skill. Yeah, also just a lot of cultural ignorance as to the ability to tell stories through games. Although I think that's fading. I don't know, Sarah, if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is just tied to the fact, the physical stuff, like you said, you don't need to be athletic. I think that's also tied to like maybe our biases about appearances, right? So like, athletes typically look a certain way, whereas, gamers don't necessarily have the same type of like, you know, physical beauty, if you will, because they're not, you don't have to develop your body in a certain way in order to game. So I think that's definitely part of it, is like, kind of like a halo effect type thing where like athletes have the physical beauty and maybe gamers don't have that attached. And I think there's also the social aspect. So like sports are, very obviously social. You're like clearly on a team, or you're clearly competing against other people. Whereas gaming, there is a social aspect, but it's hidden because there doesn't have to be a social aspect, but there can be. But like you don't visibly see it because the people are obviously behind screens. And so I think that also contributes to this idea that like, you're just kind of this loner, just doing things by yourself. And so like that also sort of feeds into this bias that like this person is not very cool or kind of a loser.
Yeah, I think I might be a skeptic about perfectionist value just like across the board, because I just don't want to say that there's any like special value to like eating as many hot dogs as possible in a minute, or stacking golf balls. Or I saw a video the other day of somebody set the Guinness Book of World record for, stopping as many moving steel fans with his tongue in a minute, like just like stuff like that. And I was like, okay, maybe there's a way of like explaining why some accomplishments have this kind of like value to them and others don't. That's like a non-arbitrary, not just going with what's culturally accepted or whatever. But if there isn't such a line, I think I would rather just reject all perfectionistic value to avoid saying that there's some special value that these things have beyond their entertainment value.
Maybe like one thing you could think about is keeping like the perfectionist value, like that domain of like perfecting human nature, and just say like certain things like the tongue dimension of stopping blades is just not like exemplary in terms of like your human nature. Like I don't, I mean, it's not even of like animal nature. I don't, it's not like an impressive cat or dog would do that. So I think like, like although it maybe shows like some perseverance or determination, and so that's good. But like when it comes, I think what's actually interesting about certain aspects of games or sports is that they can like you use your rationality, and then like certain kind of character traits, and then just the amount of like the sheer like dexterity, hand-eye movement, coordination is impressive. Now maybe it's not the most impressive, maybe like society overvalues it, but yeah, I mean, I do think sometimes like the more you learn about something, the more interesting it is, right?
Yeah, so also, I mean, one thing about games is like there's like ways of playing a game where you can get these kind of like very like meaningless perfection type achievements. The game I play is World of Warcraft, and so like one way you could play the game, and this is something people like one player did, was like he just tried to get to max level by farming herbs, which was extremely tedious, and he was the only one to do it, and that, I guess that is like an achievement that he was able to do that. But like I don't know if that's like a great way to play World of Warcraft, but I think if he enjoyed it, then maybe there is something to like this is the way he wanted to play the game, so there's like a flexibility to it. Games are so like they're so domain general. Like I think the type of achievements that you can do in games that do kind of exemplify like the good aspects of human nature, like video games do allow for that as well. So like in the same game World of Warcraft, like there's like true ways of expressing creativity. I think like the boss fights are very hard, and like you have to be creative with the strategies that you use to beat them. That's a more like typical way of expressing like this good human trait of creativity. Whereas the guy grinding his way via herbing to max level, that's more of like this weird like perfectionist type achievement. But there still might be something good about that because that's the way he chose to play.
So I might be culturally a little bit out of the loop with video games over the last 20 years. So this is my background, just so you'll know what you're dealing with here. So when I was a kid, some Christmas, it was like 1991 or 92. I got an NES for Christmas, and there's a picture of me just like jumping up and down and enjoy. I love playing Mario 3, Super Mario 3, games like that. And then some years later, I had a Nintendo 64, and I was spending a lot of time after school. Like I'd listen to my lame, not really punk music on CDs, and was just playing, the whatever incarnation of Mario it was for Nintendo 64. And it was one day in 10th grade I realized, like, hey, I want to be a writer. I should be spending this time writing and not doing this. And I just dropped it completely, except one time, which was during my first deployment, which was to Iraq in 2005 and 2006. One of the soldiers in my unit had an Xbox, and I was working for a military newspaper, and he was working in the video part of the public affairs. Sergeant Rick Robichaud, every once in a while, he'd come into the Quebec office, we called it, which is where the writers were. He's like, specialist case, we need your help here in the Romeo room. And that's like, let's get in a game of Halo. And so I got in many games of Halo that way. And there was one particularly epic one I still remember where Sergeant Robichaud, he had that like sword, and I had just the pulse gun, and he lunged at me, and I managed to zap him with the pulse gun and like hit him over the head and win the game. And it was like, yeah. So that was fun. But I haven't really kept up with video games after that kind of guilty pleasure escape from my military tedium. And it sounds like games now are tremendously complex. They have these complicated storylines, and there's this culture around it I don't really understand. The first time I really felt disconnected from like a younger generation was like, wait, people will actually like watch other people play video games like on YouTube and stuff? That's crazy to me. Like watching people play video games to me is like you want your brother to hand over the controller or something. So I guess that's my level of awareness of where we are. I'm a little bit like a generation removed from where things are right now.
Yeah, so I guess in some respects my experience is similar to yours, Spencer, although I like picked it up later in life, which maybe is unusual. So I'm the younger brother, and so I did more watching than playing as a kid. And I always had like the controller that never quite functioned as well. Like my buttons were kind of stuck and his were like flawless. Right. So that's and so I played video games, growing up, and then, every time I visited my brother, we would play, but I didn't have a console or a PC that gamed. And then my brother mentioned like this was like I don't know, 2015, 2014 or something like around there. Like, why don't you get this is on sale? Why don't you get this, like this console? And I was just thinking like, oh, well, I'll get this, but I'm never going to play it. So, but then I thought more, I'm like, well, he wants me to get it so that, the nice thing about modern games is you can play online. And so I think what he really wanted is for us to hang out, and we didn't live geographically close. So this was like a way. And so I got it. And I think like, yeah, now I play regularly, play with him about like 4 times a week, which is cool. And we've been doing that for years. I think that's like, we didn't talk on the phone or anything. So, when we play, we have like our headsets on. And so really it's just, for me, I do like the games now, like that I understand them better, but it started as like a way to hang out with him. And then I just kind of rekindled like a love that maybe I lost. I do think, classic games are great, but like the ability to tell like a story with new games is pretty incredible.
Yeah, so so I've been gaming like my whole life. I had like a Game Boy Color when I was, I got it when I was like 9 or whatever, and then I've just been playing ever since. And so like for me, like, I've sort of seen games develop. And there are definitely really complex games out there now, but I think there's also like very simple games. And I think a lot of like the gaming, if you want to call it that, that goes on is just like simple, like, Candy Crush type games, which is just kind of like a distraction type thing. So like there's certainly simple games, and there's also like a whole class of games that are kind of like meant to help you just kind of like relax, like they're called cozy games. And so like, things like Stardew Valley, or just like the kitty collector game, or just like they're just meant to be like very like soothing, comforting type thing. So like certainly are complex games, but there's also like, whole classes of games that are meant to be not complex and just to be kind of like a way of relaxing. But yeah, I mean, so the social like for me, the social aspect of gaming has always been huge. So like the game I primarily play is World of Warcraft. So like playing that game at its like highest level requires you to have a group of at least 20 people. Yeah, that's, I regularly like hang out with those people online. And although I consider myself a gamer, like I am not a gamer to the extent my friends are. Like they game constantly all day, every day. And they also enjoy watching other people game, which is something I never really got into myself.
The book is called Why It's Okay to Be a Gamer. I want you to sort of say a little bit more about that, because most people would agree, I think, that like it's okay to be a gamer. Like it's not in itself a sin or something like that. But I presumably you want to say you want to say something more positive than that. So you want to say the arguments against gaming or that vilify video games, those are not good arguments. And two, there's some real positive aspects to being a gamer, not like necessarily more positive than all alternative hobbies, but like positive nonetheless.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, very few people would be like, gaming is horrible, right? It's not like why it's okay to kill people, right? But I think so. So the critiques, it's like, yeah, gaming is okay, but is it like a great way to spend your time? So that's kind of how I understood it. And obviously, that's not like a good title. So the approach to the book, the method is like intellectual judo or jujitsu, whatever you want to call it. But it's like you take a perceived weakness or downside of gaming and then see if you could like flip it into an advantage, right? And that's not to say like there aren't actually problems with gaming. It's just like there's another side to it. And so the book's carved up into 6 chapters that address the common objections, and it starts with violence, which is kind of the classic critique of games. And then the other objections it looks at is, being a loner, which we just kind of talked about, that gaming isolates you, or like the types of social interactions you have in gaming are superficial. Then like worries about addiction, which is kind of a modern, contemporary issue, something that maybe wasn't brought up when we were kids. Sarah mentioned her friends that are gaming all the time, right? So there you might have this worry, like, is it the games that are like bringing them in? And then the final objection, which I think is probably the most interesting objection, is that it's just like a waste of time, right? Like it's not using your time well. And so those are the objections. And then, we kind of go through each and look at the advantages and disadvantages of those critiques, and then explore positives. But Sarah might want to say more about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think, people aren't saying for the most part that gaming is horrible, but I mean, I do, just to point out, like there was like a period of time where people were really worried about the violent stuff, and I don't think that's gone completely away. So like it does get routinely brought up whenever there's like a mass shooting or whatever, video games and violent media in general are brought up. And I think the addiction thing is like, I think that is something that's really lurking in the back of people's minds, especially like, talking to people that have kids. They often, when we talk to them about the book, they'll often say stuff like, yeah, I do worry that, my kid is spending too much time gaming, or they're like using it as like this sort of escapism to avoid, doing real world stuff. So I think like, yeah, there are people probably saying it's not okay to game. But yeah, the goal of the book is not to just say it's okay. It's to show that there are some real positives that can come out of it. So, like I mentioned, a lot of my friendships, like my best friendships, come from gaming. It's like it is a great way to meet people. It's also just like it's a great, especially if you're like an introverted person. It's a great way to meet people. But also, like, one of the things that people will say it's a waste of time. And so one of the things that we try to point out in the book is that the way that we talk about valuable activities is often in terms of like it's like producing something. It's like gonna help you make money. It's gonna help you become more famous. It's gonna help you advance your career. But that's just kind of the wrong way to think about what things are valuable, right? You're just like looking at all this extrinsic value, like how many dollars can I make from this hobby? But that really isn't how you should be approaching your hobbies or evaluating whether or not they're good activities. And so one of the things we try to argue is that at least some games, they have a lot of aesthetic and intellectual value. They can really help you think about things. They can help you take on new roles, so you kind of experience different ways of being an agent in the world. You can think about new perspectives. You can even think about moral issues and how one ought to behave in certain moral situations, and that can help you reflect upon things and come to some sort of deeper understanding. And so there's a lot of value to a lot of games that I think people often just overlook when they're thinking about gaming and thinking of it as like this waste of time, useless activity.
Yeah, that's maybe the most philosophically robust part of the book when you're talking about, what is an intrinsically valuable activity and that kind of stuff. So let's circle back to that later. So I guess I was sort of surprised how the section of the book that dealt with the violence issue was a lot more concessive than I expected. I thought you were going to say the scientists have looked into this and it's total garbage. No expert believes anything like this. But it seems like you're actually kind of battling some of the literature and saying, oh, well, there's not a decisive connection between gaming and violence. That seems kind of concessive. That kind of seems like you're saying there's something to that critique, even if it's not decisive or something.
It is true that there are like psychologists. So I guess I don't know like how you would carve it up like in terms of the percentages, but there definitely are like psychologists that are still around that are like voicing this kind of complaint. And it's actually like a complaint that kind of goes back to Plato, that when we observe behavior, even in like stories, that like habituates us to act in that way. And it's one of the reasons why like in Plato's Republic, he rejects stories about the gods or heroes or great humans as doing vicious things, because he thinks that will like pattern our behavior. And I really think the psychologists are just making the same claim. But then there's other psychologists who are just like, well, it doesn't support that. And so I guess maybe Sarah could say more about that, but I guess I would just point out that there is like a question about like the burden of proof in terms of like, so the fact that some psychologists think this, is that decisive enough for us to not play violent video games? I don't think so, but I guess I'll just add that the final point that although the critique might not be right, and I think we show like why in the book it ultimately doesn't support the claims they're wanting to make, I do think that they get right that like that media affects us, and so we should reflect upon like the things we're engaging with. Now, it might not reflect us, it might not affect us in like the one-to-one, like you see violence, you do violence, but it still has an effect on us.
Yeah, I think that's exactly like the last thing you said, Nick, is like, why you might have been reading like this, sort of being concessive to the idea into the book, because one of the core claims of a virtue ethical approach is that like the things that we do shape us and who we are. And so if we are choosing to engage in like violent media, we don't want to outright say that's not going to have an effect on us, right? Obviously the things we consume, the things we see, like that shapes who we are. We don't want to like outright just say like there's no effect on us from consuming like violent video games. I think the problem really is like it is an empirical claim. Like, does playing this cause you to be violent or be more aggressive? And the devil's always in the details when it comes to empirical claims like that. And so if you look into the literature, the actual psychological literature, you see that there is some research that supports the claim that playing violent video games promotes aggressive behavior, and then there's some literature that goes against it. So what you have to do is you have to actually look at, well, what are they studying? How are they operationalizing these things? And it ends up being really messy. And so what we try to argue is, like, if you looking at the studies like as a whole, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of support for the claim that there is this causal relationship between violent video games and aggressive behavior. Given it's like a hobby that a lot of people enjoy, if you wanted to make the empirical claim, it ought to be really well supported. If you want to like be making any sort of public action against playing video games, like there better be really good data to support the claim that they really are harming society. And I just don't think that data is there. And the whole this whole idea of like violent video games in general, it's just such an ill-defined class of games. Like, what even is going to count as a violent video game? Pretty much every game that you play is going to have some aspect of violence in it. Like even Pokemon with its like has a very like cute aesthetic, but like there's like Pokemon has like a move called guillotine, right? Or a flamethrower, right? And they're like battling each other. Like there's something violent to that. So like it's like even like carving up what is even going to count as a violent video game so that we can study the effect of violent video games. That in itself is like a huge methodological hurdle that has not actually been properly resolved in the literature.
I think you're maybe overstating the we don't know what's violent, what's not violent. It's pretty clear we're talking about like Grand Theft Auto and not Mario Kart. Like I guess like throwing a turtle shell as violence in some cartoonish sense, but it's not what people are worried about. Yeah, okay, they haven't proven their claims, but if all I know is, hey, I'm a non-expert. I know some experts think that there's a link, an important, possibly causal link between playing certain sorts of video games and violent behavior. It's a matter of controversy, but there might be something there. Isn't that a reason for me to choose another hobby?
I think depending upon like your age and maturity is relevant here, right? So like, I imagine you watch rated R films, and maybe that wouldn't be like suitable when you're a child. But like, I do think that this is an art form. Not all games have stories to tell, but some of the stories that you can tell through games are really wonderful and captivating. And some of those are like violent games. So I know these don't mean anything, but maybe the audience like BioShock, The Last of Us. So Last of Us is very moving. And I think BioShock is philosophical. I think they use the violence well. Some of it is fun to engage with, but I think, yeah, I mean, so if it is an art form and the violence is used thoughtfully, then I think like even if you're like suspicious about like if you're worried, like if you're suitably mature, it seems appropriate for you to engage with it. Now, yeah, there are some like really heinous games that engage with like heinous content. Typically those aren't even fun to play. And I guess my view is like I guess I would steer young people away from like Mario Kart's fine, but like yeah, I mean things with mature content I would restrict to like I would maybe push for them for mature audiences. I guess I am somewhat sympathetic to what you're saying, Spencer, even regardless of the evidence. But I don't think maybe this occurred when you were a kid, but like when you're playing games, like what is the real viciousness that occurs? Well, oftentimes it's like being a jerk to your fellow players. That is like, to me, besides the content, that's like where I think where we often see like character really come out with respect to other players. And that usually doesn't have to do with the content, but it's more just like the situation and your personality.
You might think participating in an unjust act of violence, like even in a play sort of context, is worse than just like observing it. Yeah, I mean, watching somebody commit a murder depicted in a realistic way might not be something suitable for children. If you think that, though, you might think that there's something more concerning about actually performing it in a way that's visual. Even if you don't think that there's any kind of link with violent behavior, you might just think there's something intrinsically not good about this. So I'm sure you remember Mortal Kombat with the fatalities at the end. It's a game I would play at my friend's house. My parents, of course, would not let me own it, but they didn't mind if I occasionally played it at other people's houses. But so that at the end, if you win it's one of those fighter games. I don't even know what you call them anymore. But when you win a match, it's like you get the order to finish him, and you can put in different combinations to dispatch your opponent in various gory ways. Some of them quite gory, even though the graphics. But you might still think there's just something gross about, I'm going to kill the person who's no longer a threat to me. There's just something gross about enacting that. And probably I'm not going to become a serial killer or anything like that, but it does seem you're exercising some kind of sadism muscle in your mind that should be left unexercised.
So let me just try to flip that a little bit. So I think there is something, so like I enjoy sometimes committing brutal acts in games, and I kind of like revel in it. And you might think, well, that's indicative of some viciousness in me that I shouldn't be feeding that. But one way to think about it is like, when I'm doing that, I can reflect on like, why do I have these urges? Like, and what is that like what is bad about it? And what is bad about it if if I were to engage it in the real world, like why would that be bad, and why is this different? And so like I think like going through like, the sort of, maybe if you, I don't even want to call it viciousness, but maybe you would, of like, how we treat things in games, it does provide like this opportunity for like reflection on morality, and like on myself and how I engage with the world. And just like, what is taboo and why is it taboo? And I think, it's just like, it does prompt, and it can prompt at least, this kind of like intellectual reflection and self-learning.
I would make a distinction. So for me, like, I guess thinking through like the Mortal Kombat case, right? I do think that there might be a contrast between something like that, where like, it requires you as an agent to really step back and reflect, but it's not like the game is like, finish him, and now you're like supposed to, not, the game's not like prompting a philosophical question to finish or not to finish, right? But then you can think about like BioShock. So like one of the games, like you're given you enter this area and you're given a baseball, and there's like an interracial marriage, and you're given the option to like throw the ball or not throw it at like this baseball at them. And like, I think I don't remember, but I think either way, the town gets mad at you. And so like, why, like there, like the game isn't racist, but it's putting you in this like racist area, and then making you confront, like, what do you do? So that is, I think that is like philosophical, that's political. So we might think, okay, that has like deep meaning, let's keep that. But what about like Mortal Kombat finish him? I do think like for adults, it's probably just some fun. I don't know if Socrates would engage with it, but I think some of this for me, like, so I grew up doing martial arts, like primarily wrestling, but as a kid, like I did boxing and I did kickboxing, and there I'm like actually hitting people, right? And I never liked describing that as acts of violence, given that it's in the confines of like a sport and there's consent, but also I think more than consent, it's in this confine of sport. And so I think like Mortal Kombat is still, it's like in this imaginary realm. So that mean like maybe some of the grossness shouldn't be there, but I do think like the more over the top it is kind of like in the realm of fun. Whereas like if I think of it as like almost like more realistic or like not over the top, like if you're ripping a spine out, like that's not a human move. I don't think so. So I think that does kind of remove like some people in the like philosophy of play, like you're in this magic circle. Now, I don't think that means like everything is okay, but I think some extension of morality is allowed.
You could also turn on the friendship setting where they shake hands and make up at the end. If you want to really be considered lame by all your friends, you could turn on that. I think that's there to like lure parents into buying it. And then of course, like no 13-year-old boy is going to have that on. So just to finish up on the violence issue, it seems to me that there's a pretty close analogy that I'm sure has occurred to both of you between arguments against violent video games and arguments against pornography or certain kinds of pornography. And I think in both cases, critics have done themselves a disservice by like dramatically overstating their points. I used to hear it said that pornography was like turning men into rapists and serial killers. Like, if that were true, we should just be seeing an explosion of violent crime, for how much pornography usage there is. But we don't see that. And we don't see that with violent video games either. So if there is an effect, it's probably not enormous, or if it is large, it's being drowned out by other societal trends or something like that. Although the lingering doubt I've got about that is it's just really hard to control for, like, what if it's fun in 10,000 people with a variety of other particular psychological factors? Someone like that could be pushed over the edge in like playing a video game that's violent or something like that. It would be really hard to test for that. And there's some reason to think that, although this isn't like, I'm not proving this, I'm just suggesting it's a hypothesis. It's hard to eliminate. There's some reason to think that there might be something like this happening. So although the rate of murders has gone down precipitously since the early 90s, with a recent little bit of an uptick around 2019, 2020, the rate of mass shootings and your risk of being killed by a stranger is higher than it used to be. And then there are particular shootings, like there was this one mosque shooting in New Zealand in 2017 where the guy live streamed the whole thing, and it seemed to imitate what a first-person shooter game would look like. It's hard to prove one way or the other whether in the aggregate out of when we're looking at many thousands of people, whether someone's violence is going to be prompted by this, or it would take a different form than it otherwise would. Although that wouldn't necessarily be any reason for me not to play a violent video game like that, if I have a good reason to believe I'm unlikely to be one of those people.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, so first of all, like, isolating it as an actual causal factor is just like, obviously, like, methodologically incredibly difficult. But like, you can look at like very broad trend. Like, the only like kind of way you can kind of get at it is like, you can look at, well, when is a very popular violent game released, and then you see, well, what happens to violent acts after it's released. And so that is one way of getting at the possible causal connection. And it turns out there is data on this, that the violence does not go up after a popular violent video game release. And in fact, it goes down a little bit. At a population level, that's one way of trying to get at that question. For an individual, simply doesn't seem methodologically possible to ever isolate like a violent video game as the cause of an incident. And so I think then you have to look at, so of course it's a possibility that it's impacting it, but then you have to look at, well, did it have, like you mentioned, like, it could have been anything, like, could have been the trigger. If somebody is already, like, somebody has that sort of constitution, like, it's not necessarily going to be the game itself. And then I think also we should be looking at the fact that there's not just downsides to gaming, there are upsides as well. And I think that's where there's a big perhaps disconnect between the porn and violence cases, right? So like, I don't think porn is ever going to be like developing you intellectually or aesthetically, whereas video games, I think there is a good argument for this contributing to like true cultivation of virtue. And so given that games do have this positive effect on us, so that's reason to not just look at the negatives, even if the negatives are perhaps there. Just like with drugs, right? So like, drugs always have the potential for side effects, but you look at the risk-reward ratio.
I want to hit briefly on the addiction thing. That's the other kind of empirical objection to video games, before we move on to talk about your positive case for how this helps develop virtue. I guess I had this reaction to reading that portion of the book, it sort of seemed to me like there is a very narrowly defined medical definition of addiction, and video games are not addictive in that sense. And then there's this other sense, this like very casual usage of addiction. Like there's even like a Chex Mix called addiction, because it's like you eat one, you have some of it and you want to eat more of it, or like, oh, I'm addicted to these potato chips, I have to have another one. Or it's like, okay, sure, maybe they're addictive in that sense, but so is everything like enjoyable. And I guess I sort of thought that there was like a middle bar that was missing there. That was like, it's a addiction meant in a fairly serious sense that may not have any kind of clinical definition to it. But if somebody is like, here's something I've read about. I've read about gambling addiction. And I don't think gambling addiction meets the clinical definition. Like there's not a chemical that's being put into the body is being habituated to. But you read some of the descriptions of like really extreme gambling addiction, and there might as well be, the stuff is so extreme sometimes. Like it gets to the point that someone will be at a slot machine and the building will be on fire or flooding, and they'll have to send someone in to pull the person out because they'll be there pulling the lever over and over and over again. I don't care whether that meets the medical definition of addiction. It means addiction in the normatively significant sense. And so could video games be addictive like that to some people? I think the answer is probably yes. And I think maybe your case is just yes, but it doesn't have to be that way. And it's gaming's total effect on society needs to be evaluated in terms of its positive effects too. Is there anything else you'd want to say about that though?
I'll start, and then like Sarah knows like a bunch about this, but I would just say like, so gambling is so strictly speaking, it is like an object of addiction. And I think that this is important because right, if gaming is addictive, it would probably be addictive in that way. So what we argue that like in the, there are some elements of gaming that sadly do resemble gambling, and they have cost players like lots of money. And we would say like that, that might be addictive in the same way that gambling is addictive. And it makes sense because it just seems to be an instance of a type of gambling. But unlike gambling, like you can't, like, I mean, it's somewhat of a philosophical question, but like, I don't know if you can remove the gambling aspect, like the risk aspect of gambling, and still gamble. Like it seems like the risk needs to be part of it. But those features often detract like the features that resemble gambling in video games. Those features often detract from like the actual gameplay experience. And there are frequently things that gamers complain about. Maybe not all, but a lot do. And you actually can remove those from the video game. So it's not, so I would say like that kind of risk is not an essential part of video games. And so it does seem like, but with gambling, it is an essential part. And so that's like, when we're thinking about games ethically, that does become a critique of video games in a sense, but it's more like game developers stop doing this. That's not good for society.
Yeah, so gambling is considered a behavioral addiction. In the psychology world, gaming addiction is currently being considered as to whether or not it should be classified as a behavioral addiction alongside gambling. And so one reason why gambling ended up making it to being considered an addiction, there was a long period of time where behavioral addictions weren't classified as addictions. They were classified as something else. And the reason why the substance use gambling ended up being going with that is because of the way that our best knowledge, the way we've learned that addiction works basically in the brain. And so that has something to do with essentially like disrupting the homeostasis of the reward system, if you will. So like you're driven to do certain behaviors, and normally once you do the behavior, you're sort of like satiated and you're not going to do it again. But the way that drugs of abuse work and the way that the gambling reward system works is that it basically leaves our brain in such a state where you do the behavior, but like you still want to continue doing it. So like the stasis of the reward system isn't like returned back to normal. And so gambling, there's like, data that that's the way it works in the brain, similar to the way that drugs of abuse sort of like hook the brain. And so the question is, is gaming doing a similar thing? And like that's, I think, really what's going to like make or break whether or not it gets considered an actual addiction. And like Nick said, like there are aspects of gaming that resemble gambling. So loot boxes and stuff like that, like game companies like implement those gambling like structures into gameplay because they know that it's going to make people spend more money on their game and keep playing. And so like to that extent, like yeah, I think there are like addictive aspects of some games. But like Nick said, like that's not like a necessary aspect of games. And in fact, like developers could design games in a way to actively avoid such things. Now, of course, they have financial incentive to include the gambling aspect because it does promote the sort of compulsive play, but it's not a necessary part of games. And I think, when you're talking about the sort of middle stance, I think, there is like this other issue to consider, which is just like, problematic engagement in gaming. And I think that is a problem where people kind of like use gaming to avoid, their real life problems, like a kind of like escapist thing. But I think that is something different than addiction. I think it's like, it is something that could be problematic about gaming, but I think that's not necessarily a problem with the game itself. I think that sort of reflects other issues that are going on in a person's life, and they're kind of using gaming to avoid dealing with those issues. So it's not necessarily like the game itself is what is, being causing the person to compulsively play.
A common theme here in a lot of these answers is that a lot of arguments that attempt to be arguments against gaming and gamers, either they only attack a subset of games and a subset of gamers, or they overgeneralize and like attack gaming in general, but like a bunch of other things too. It's a kind of a common theme we're seeing. One other thing I wanted to say about addiction, I guess I want to ask you this, Sarah. In looking at how behavioral addiction is defined, do you think that there's a kind of implicit normativity built into the definitions? Like we just sort of know without looking at any brain scans or anything that me wanting to play with my 2-year-old again and again is not ever going to be considered any kind of addiction because that's a good thing. So like even if no normative terms are explicitly there in the definitions, we're assuming that an addictive behavior is going to be one that is like detrimental in at least some serious respect.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in general, like, you're not going to consider something a mental illness or a mental disorder unless it is perceived as, being like there's a normative aspect to all diagnoses like that. Like it's, there's something going wrong. And so, yeah, so like the things that we look at positively, it's unlikely to, it's ever going to be the case that they're going to make it to the DSM, right? So there's this great satirical article where it's like, should happiness be considered a mental illness, right? And so if you look at like the state of happiness and you compare it to like, the diagnosis for depression, like you can kind of give like a parallel diagnosis for excessive happiness, but nobody's ever going to put that in DSM because there's the normative aspect is that being happy is a good thing. So you're right that there's of course this normative aspect.
Then this is the perfect segue to the positive case, because if you can then show that gaming, or at least certain kinds of gaming, are conducive to a virtuous life, that can help answer the addiction challenge. So let me just ask you about that. What is, I guess, distinctive in video games as far as cultivating virtue and friendship and things that are good?
I guess I do want to answer that question, but I would just, preface the answer by like, for video games I think there's like you know, because we're philosophers and we also like Sarah and I are gamers, like, you know, we want to show like the, you know, video games have this unique good, but in order for them to be beneficial, they don't have to be uniquely good, right? And I think that one of the tricky things about video games is that they overlap with so many other things. Like they're kind of like sports. Not all games. Some games are like movies, right? But they interact like crossword puzzles. So the problem is, you know, is it a work of literature? So it just like overlaps with like so many other things. It's oftentimes hard to pinpoint what is unique about them. But generally, one feature that is thought to be unique is the interactivity, which, you know, was raised earlier with respect to violence. Like watching a movie is passive, right? So maybe but when you're playing a game, it's in some sense you're making the choice, right? So I think that is like probably the unique aspect that's thought to be the unique aspect of them. And I think in terms of reflection, that is like really interesting. So some games implement like a branching mechanic where the choices you make will alter the game in a profound way. So you could play through it multiple times and get different endings. But and there's different ways to play these games. So like one is to try to find the good ending, right? The most interesting ending or the happy ending. But another is just to make choices that you would think like the characters would make, like if you were this character. And so while you're doing that, I mean, there is something interesting here because you're occupying the gamer's perspective, but then you're also occupying the different players' perspective. And within a single game, it at a single moment, like at one point you might be like player A making the choice, and at another point you're player B, and that could be really aesthetically, intellectually interesting because they might have like a conflict with each other. And then you, the gamer, are trying to figure out like, how should I resolve this conflict, right?
So this is like a kind of a dialectical judo move, right? Almost. So somebody's saying like, isn't violence worse in video games because you are an active participant in it? Part of the response might be, if you acknowledge that there's something unique about being an active participant in the unfolding drama, then that should also confer something about all decisions and all sort of activities that are made in the game, like aesthetically. And just singling violence out of that overlooks the larger picture of how this is like an aesthetically unique experience.
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, being able to, you know, take on these different perspectives and then, you know, figure out, you know, what should I do, you know, from this perspective, like what's good, like for this character given this skill set. That is like, you know, that is like a totally unique aesthetic experience. And I mean, another thing that you also get the sort of like intellectual value of like, I mean, they're kind of like it's kind of like a thought experiment, but you are actually like embedding a whole host of other like rich details and emotions. And so like a lot of games will employ some version of like a trolley problem type dilemma, where you have to like choose, you know, should I save these people or should I save these people? But it's as opposed to like, you know, the usual trolley problem where there's like no details there. Now you have to think through the details and you have to think about, well, what is morally relevant? And so yeah, it's providing that, like it provides these kind of like, you know, rich details that you have to like, if you're playing in a certain way, if you want to play in this way, like you have to actually reflect upon, why is this right, or why should I do this in this case? And then you get to see what the effects of your action actually are. Like, I killed this set of people with my action, and now I get to see how they react to me based off of that. And then I could play the game another time, and I can make a different choice. I can see how people react to the different decision that I make. You can learn a lot from that process.
You're, of course, familiar with Nozick's experience machine thought experiment that challenges hedonism, like a life plugged into a machine that just makes you passively absorb pleasure would not be a good life. And so I've been wondering for a long time about different variations of this case, like what we would think about them. So what if we make the modification that the experience machine isn't purely passive, but you are interacting, you are making choices within the experience machine. Does it seem less bad to you? And what if you could unplug a certain amount of the time? Like suppose you spent 1 day a week outside of the experience machine with real friends and stuff. Would it be okay to spend the rest of your time in the experience machine? What I'm getting at here is that I wonder video games might become more and more immersive and more like an interactive experience machine thing. And so is there a point where it could get too immersive that we'd be leaving behind too much value in the real world just in virtue of the fact that we're spending it in a digital environment? Or do you think that it could be the case that we could have like a Ready Player One kind of world where we all sort of plug in, and it's almost like Chalmers has this essay, The Matrix is Metaphysics, where if you have a matrix-like world fleshed out in as much detail, when you're plugged into the matrix, you're not in a skeptical scenario. That really is the world. You're just ignorant of its like fundamental causes and constitution, but so are we in the physical world. Do you think there would come a point of involvement that would be just inherently problematic, or how would you see these sorts of questions?
Well, I guess I would just, I mean, obviously it's a thought experiment. So, and like, just kind of illuminates maybe like one of the difference between like the game thought experiment, where I would like already have these details, and then like just kind of this thin thought experiment, which is still valuable. I'm not knocking it, but like, I guess I want to know, like, is like the world going to fall apart? Like, are animals, like, is the environment screwed when we all plug in? Like, well, assuming that it's not, right? Then yeah, I mean, I totally think it's fine to plug in. I think it would also, like I told you, I enjoy watching football. I like combat sports. I think it would be better if we did those all virtually, because I don't want to injure people, and I don't want to be injured myself, right, when I do them. And I think that there's other things that we could do creatively, like fly and things like that we could explore, that would be fun to do. And then in terms of like the time balance, like assuming that there's not, like, things aren't going poorly, we're not neglecting the world, then yeah, I mean, I totally think it's fine. So Bernard Suits wrote The Grasshopper, which is in the philosophy of games, is like this great book. And he argues that, utopia is playing games. The central utopian activity is playing games, because in utopia, everything else would be taken care of, right? And he thinks in a utopia, you would know everything, so you wouldn't be pursuing it. So what is the thing that would make sense to do? Well, it would make sense to play games with friends. And I don't know, I don't fully agree with that, but I do think, yeah, I mean, in such a scenario, it does make sense.
That book sounds really interesting. I think I'm going to have to read it for the next time I teach a course on like the good life or something like that. It sounds very useful. Sarah, did you have anything to add to that point?
So, I've always had the intuition that the experience machine is fine to plug into. This is maybe the one place I agree with Chalmers, where like I don't think there's anything inherently, bad about the virtual, or like we're losing out something, like by like the real is somehow different. Assuming, like Nick said, like the environment isn't going to like collapse, and assuming that like there's not some sort of like inequality in who can access the group experience machine. Yeah, I don't think that. I think there actually is quite a few benefits to being able to plug in. As we can enjoy, we could freely pursue the things that we want to pursue without having to worry about meeting these sort of physical needs. And yeah, I also recommend The Grasshopper. So yeah, the idea that we would then choose in the machine to play games, I think that's probably right. I think a lot of us would choose to play games given all of our other needs are met.
So Sarah, just to clarify, are you saying that you would plug in even in the original Nozick experience, where you're just passively absorbing the pleasurable experiences that are generated by the machine, and you're in there alone and all your friends are NPCs?
Yeah, yeah, my students are always, appalled by this, but yes, I think that is my stance.
I'm with your students, I'm afraid. I am with your students on this one.
Yeah, obviously shifting from video games, but yeah, it does. My problem is the neglect of like your commitments, right, that you've made by existing through your life, would just like you're just saying, okay, well, too bad, cats. I'm plugging in.
So this is kind of a random thing, but it kind of stuck out at me in the book and it's been on my mind. And maybe it can help illustrate how video games can help cultivate virtue and help us see different distinctions in character and all this sort of thing. This pejorative term, try hard, I'd never encountered it before. And I started reading about it online, like through Urban Dictionary and various other places. And I guess it's like one of these terms that we think of as new, but it's actually been around for a while. Like OMG and woke and try hard were all like expressions used in the 1920s, but they've like been taken up more recently. And sometimes the meaning is modified a bit. But it just sounds to me like this is what you call someone who beats you. You accuse them of putting too much effort into it or something like that. I'm not seeing how this is like a legitimate put down. Like if I sign up for the local fun run, a charity fun run, and I like kick my own ass and I'm huffing and puffing to like get the best time I possibly can get, which is like in 48th place or something like that. Am I being a tryhard? Like, I don't know. I'm not really seeing this. Could you guys help me with this?
Yeah, so we're working on a new paper on tryhards and slouches, which would be the tryhard is maybe the vice of excess, and a slouch is the vice of deficiency, and we're calling the virtuous state the seemly person, which is or the seemly gamer, but it could be seemly person, which is a throwback to Cicero's On Duty. We don't talk about seemliness too much, but anymore, it's maybe outdated. But actually, I think it turns out to be like one of the most central virtues or dispositions one could have. And so I think like to start with, start with what is a try? Well, if you like go through Urban Dictionary and like, it's kind of interesting because outside of gaming, right? When I was in high school, someone would also in junior high, someone would also be a try hard if they were like trying to fit in too much, right? And someone would be like, oh, they're a try hard or a tool. I actually think that there's an interesting similarity between that and the gamer try hard, and there might be like a unifying concept that underpins both of them. And so like there are like two central uses of try hard in gaming. The first is like what you said, like you're just kind of venting about not being good, right? Oh, the top runners are all try hard, or I got killed 100 times in this game because you're a try hard. And there it's just like, that's not a vice. You just are bad and you're complaining, right? But you might think there are certain things that we shouldn't care about or put as much effort into, right? Like the thing just doesn't matter that much. And when we exceed like the amount of effort either required to be successful or just care too much, or build in like a bunch of extrinsic things, like the person who is just cool supposedly doesn't care what other people think. But the tryhard is wearing the same clothes as the cool person, but they care like tremendously. And that's what makes them uncool. And so I think that like kind of applies to video games. Like we're playing supposedly this relaxed game and you're like intensely sweating and ruining the experience for everyone else. And so I call you a tryhard because now I'm having to try hard, and that this game was supposed to be chill. And so I think you, in that case, you have exceeded what is appropriate. Not the worst thing you can do, but yeah, I mean, you've got things wrong. You've got the priorities of the situation wrong.
If you're being a tryhard, like you can ruin things for everybody else who is playing. So like if it's a casual mode of gaming and you are, you've maxed out everything and you're like playing the optimal build and everybody else just wanted to kind of like, try out and experiment other things, or they're just new to the game, right? And they just want to like, figure out how to play. And then you have somebody who is just like going into that casual or new person mode and destroying everyone. Well, then nobody else wants to play that casual mode anymore because you can't play it casually. The tryhard has taken over and ruined it for people. And so that is a way in which it is like you are actually doing something, you're playing in the wrong way. And we can criticize you for it.
Kind of makes me think of one time when I was a study abroad student in Morocco. There were some other students who I guess wanted to play Scrabble, but they're like, but we're like serious about Scrabble. Like, you might not want to play with us. So like, I'll play with you. And they like had memorized the Scrabble dictionary or something. They always knew like, here's some weird word that's mostly consonants that you'd think wouldn't count because it looks like a foreign word, but oh, it's here. We already know it's in the Scrabble dictionary, so you can't challenge us on anything. And I kind of thought, yeah, like I'm not going to play Scrabble with you anymore. Okay. I guess it's that kind of like if everyone played Scrabble like that, like I'm just not going to put that much time into this. I'd rather, go bowling or something.
Yeah, but note that like one thing that's kind of interesting there is like, so you knew that that's how they're going to play Scrabble, right? So that's their
true.
Scrabble game. So
That's
like
true.
now if you had gone into that game and you had been, I don't know if Scrabble's ever has teammates, but if you had been the teammate of one of those intense Scrabble players and you weren't playing to the level that the game that they've decided to play the game at, then you would have the opposite vice there of slouchiness, right? That you would not be putting enough effort into the game that they've chosen to play, so you can be vicious in the opposite direction as well.
An excellent example of a try-hard is Chip Douglas in The Cable Guy, which I don't know if people still watch, but it's a casual game of basketball, and he shows, and everyone's like in random t-shirts and just kind of like enjoying the game, and he takes it way too seriously and eventually like dunks the ball and shatters the glass and ruins the game for everyone. And I think he was mostly doing this because he was trying to impress, I can't remember the character's name, but he was trying to impress this friend he had, and also he was a little bit jealous of Jack Black's character, who was also friends with the guy. So he really wanted to show everyone up. So that's a classic case of a try-hard. Now the one, so we can see how like he ruined the game for everyone. And then like with respect to that, we were thinking like, okay, well, is being a try-hard just this social thing, or can one be a try hard in solo activities? And yeah, I mean, I think try hard extends to everything. And actually, when you start to see it as something you can, that is relevant for like single player activities or like your life, it actually gets to be like a profound virtue, because ultimately it's about priorities. And so there is this social domain, right? Like if people are taking Scrabble serious, like this one game, and I want to play, and they told me, then I need to take it seriously, because that's that. But then there's like the domain of your life. Okay, I can play this Scrabble seriously when I'm doing that, but how much should it matter to me? It shouldn't matter that much. And if it does, then you're also a tryhard. So there's the domain of like what others are doing, but then there's also the domain of like excellence or just general appropriateness. Like there's a kind of objective standard. And if you exceed that, so like if you really care about getting into an Ivy League school and it devastates you, yeah, you are a try-hard, and maybe it should matter, but it shouldn't matter that much.
I think of a student I had when I was a grad student at Colorado some years ago, where she was so upset that her grade was a 97 instead of a 98. And like, you're getting all the credit you can get out of this course. Like, what? what is the deal here? So I can see a kind of viciousness to that. Sort of like that seems excessive.
I do kind of wonder, like I have like this, this, I do kind of have this like wonder, and I don't know where I stand on this, but like, the Olympics just occurred. I just wonder if like, so I was like super serious when I was an athlete, and I do wonder if like most of that, like all the activities we engage in maybe just matter too, like there's maybe a sense in which we're all like tryhards, like we all just care about stuff that doesn't matter too much. And if that's right, then I think we would probably need to radically restructure our lives. But I don't know.
Yeah, that's probably right. It's probably like what the Buddhists would diagnose as like attachment or something, like oh, that interview, just mulling that over. I guess there there's something adjacent to tryhardism in that kind of rumination.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I definitely think there's a connection there. And so like in Cicero's, like he was actually thinking, the reason why I thought seemliness is appropriate is like when he's talking about seemliness or on decorum, he does references like jokes and games, and then there's like this domain specific, and he has this idea of being like a gentleman, but we can like remove that kind of and just think about like what's appropriate given like how people around you behave, right? So there's that norm, like society's norm, but then there's also this, for him, like this human nature objective norm, and I like that dual aspect of it. And one of the things that's interesting is that where he's supposed to be, like this discussion of decorum or seemliness is in the section on moderation, but he doesn't really talk about moderation that much. And so I think it's like for him it's not actually a virtue, it's something like associated with virtues. But to me, if I was going to like put it in the four cardinal virtues, it would be like what we're really getting at is like a way of exercising moderation. I actually think moderation is probably the supreme virtue because
Well,
it does underpin everything.
if you think about coolness, coolness has a lot to do with not appearing to be caring too much about what people think about you, even though it's clear that you must, and you do. Miles Davis, first track of Kind of Blue, is So What, but performing at a really high level. And of course, you read his biography, his autobiography, it's clear that he was like obsessed with like pushing the boundaries of music in all these different ways. So it wasn't like, certainly he was striving about as much as it's possible to strive for anything aesthetically, but he was giving this appearance of not caring. That seems like what coolness is, but coolness is, I think, largely exterior. It's largely how you appear to other people, where it seems like you could be cool, but then still be a tryhard if you actually were in fact putting in more effort than the activity demanded, but you were just not letting others see that that's what you were doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think maybe, I mean, this is like going back, but like my knowledge of music maybe isn't, but I think the same was true of like Nirvana and Kurt Cobain. Like it was thought that like he didn't really care, but then like after he died, like going through his notes and stuff, he seemed to actually like really care about how Nirvana's success. But notice like there is like a sense in which he became less cool when that happened too, right? So I do think it probably is I don't know about, I do think there is like a connection between being seemly and actually being cool. It's just that like we don't gain access to like the inner thoughts until people reveal them. And so we're often mistaken.
Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times, if you found out that the cool person was actually trying really hard to be cool, that would definitely diminish their coolness. So yeah, I think a lot of it is like, if it like, actually not trying is really important. one of the things that's kind of been interesting as gaming has gotten, more popular is like there is like a lack of like care, like gamers are associated with like a lack of like caring about what other people think about them. And so I think like it's becoming cooler to be a gamer, and I think that's kind of tied to the fact that there is like gamers don't really care about their appearance, right? They're not trying too hard to be a certain way. They're just kind of like enjoying their hobby. And as we've seen, gamers kind of become cooler in the eyes of society. Yeah, I think it's might be tied to that fact that gamers don't really care about what other people think about them, or at least that's the stereotype.
I think you can actually go wrong, right, in caring too much what other people think, but it's also a mistake to not care at all what people think, right? So that's like it's about getting it right, right? So because it's a way of showing like now we're not like shouldn't be overly concerned about like certain norms, but like it is a way of showing respect that if everyone around you is doing something, that unless you have like and you were to do something different, it would be like disruptive. You should kind of like unless you have really strong reasons not to, you should conform. Like it's a way of showing respect to others. So if like you enter this Scrabble game and everyone's doing something like this, and you want to like you should conform unless there's an overriding reason not to. So I think we're like as a society, we're probably wrong about coolness. Like it's about caring to the right amount what other people think, right? It's not ignoring others altogether. But it's also not like, oh, do they like my shoes? Like, like not being caught up in like petty things.
So one thing gamers will sometimes do, like they'll be like, "Oh, it's just a game. Like I don't have to like why do I have to be serious, or why do I have to like, actually try if it's just a game?" But like that is like there are some games where like, everybody they want to try, they want to play to their best of their ability. And if you go into that type of game and then it's disrespectful not to also be playing to the best of your ability. So yeah, like hitting the seemly, the mean is really important. Being seemly, that's what's important.
Is graceful another word we could use for the golden mean in this context?
So we originally had it as being like the virtue was appropriateness. Obviously, that's like the problem is like that's just so general, right? Because being courageous would be like everything would be appropriate. I think that seemliness connects up with norms of etiquette, and I think that being graceful also probably does too. So that would be good. Graceful also has a nice aesthetic component, which seemliness does too. Looking a certain way, like or appearing at least internally a certain way, right? But I don't know if graceful has. I mean, maybe it does has like an element of judgment. I'm also not sure if seemliness does too, but maybe there's just not a word that captures all of it.
Yeah, we're open to suggestions. We've been trying to find a good word for this for a while now.
We were told so we presented this at a games conference, and there was a political philosopher there, and they said that we're less familiar with this literature, but that there's a debate in political philosophy about etiquette, and there's like some people who are really defending it as this important political notion or social notion. And so I do think like the person there who was referencing this, I think they were right in pushing us to recognize that this connection with that. But I don't know if there's a word that's going to capture everything.
We've covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on?
I guess one thing maybe we didn't really mention is just the value of play itself, independently of anything that it's bringing about. Like what I think there's a lot of good things that gaming can do. I think it can cultivate a lot of good things in us. Like it can help us appreciate various intellectual things. There's like all these like we can develop skills in games, and I think all that's great. But games are also just fun, and I think it's a good way to spend your time if that is something you find fun. And I think that if it is something that you enjoy spending your time doing, I think that in itself is a good reason to play.
Yeah, so connected to that, there's likely a virtue of playfulness, right? The person who never engages in play is making a mistake. And actually, this is a point that Aristotle, I think, recognized. He is a little bit broader than Plato in terms of his discussion of the virtues because he's willing to like go into deeper taxonomies. And it's often translated as wit. If you read the Nicomachean Ethics, the wittiness, and then the vices, of excess is like buffoonery, and then also being like dull. But he introduces it in the context of play, and then it extends to like jokes, and then that's all he focuses on. I think he should have kept it broader, and there's this dimension of human life about being playful, and playing games is just one way of doing that. But if there's other ways that are that fit you better, then pursue those. But there really needs to be, I think that there really is play in the good life.
Yeah, it's one thing that you guys bring out really well, and toward the end of the book is that well, what are you getting out of that? Isn't always an appropriate question to ask, right? Like, it's a nice autumn day. I think I'm going to take a walk around the block. Well, what are you getting out of that? What does that lead to? What is that? That's like, well, that's just not the way to think about it. You don't want to instrumentalize your life in this way. So fair enough. Good point. Well, Sarah and Nick, thank you so much for joining me on Micro-Digressions. The book is Why It's Okay to Be a Gamer, and I recommend it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.